Hello, it's Dr. Guillemette coming at you one more time with another video. Today we're talking about Rise of the Metahumans. What is the probability of being a hero? In this video, we're going to explore conditional probabilities and the complement rule and how we can use those to solve problems. But I also want to look at the Venn diagrams of these things so that it helps us develop a conceptual understanding. So here's the setup for our problem. In Metropolis, a recent study revealed that 15% of all superpowered infants, those with inherent metahuman abilities, are born through the Star Labs Genesis program, a specialized birthing process of the infants born through, a specialized birthing process, my bad. Of the infants born through the Genesis program, about 40% possess multiple powers. Okay, so not just one power. They're not just a speedster. They got lots of powers, right? Like freeze breath and stuff. So, what is the probability of being born with multiple powers, right? What is the probability of being born outside of the Genesis program? Is any of this unusual in the Day of Heroes? So these might be questions that we ask ourselves as we go forward and we're thinking about these things. All right, so here we go. We're going to formalize that first question. What is the probability that a randomly selected superpowered infant was born through the Genesis program and possesses multiple powers? So I think I want to pause right here. It's a randomly selected superpowered infant, okay? And this is actually going to be really important because 15% of all superpowered infants are born through the... So our population is only superpowered infants. I don't actually know how many metahumans there are. I just know that 15% of those that are metahumans are born in this Genesis program. That's going to be really important here in a minute. All right, so the probability that a randomly selected superpowered infant was conceived through the Genesis program and has multiple powers is... the and is going to give us a clue here. All right, so our probability is going to be the probability of being born through the Genesis program and having multiple powers. So Genesis program and multiple powers is the probability of this. So this is a conjunction, right? This is an intersection of these two probabilities. We're going to end up multiplying. Now, we're going to substitute the values for the probability of being born through the Genesis program and the probability of having multiple powers given that you were born through the Genesis program. Okay? Being born in the Genesis program changes your probability of having multiple powers. So this is why it's a dependent probability. We're going to plug these into a formula and simplify it to find the answer to our original problem. All right? Now, in the setup, from your book or your instructor course, you probably have the probability of A and B is equal to the probability of A times the probability of B given A. So if these are dependent events, if the probability of B depends on A, then we have this dependent probability here. Okay? So the probability that the Genesis program... So we have to determine what's the probability of the Genesis program, and then what's the probability of having multiple powers if you're born through, given that you're born through the Genesis program. Okay? Well, we know that the probability of being born through the Genesis program is 15% from our intro. Okay? We know that the probability of having multiple powers given you were born through the Genesis program is 40% because that was given in the intro. Okay? So now it's just a matter of substitution, right? So if we're trying to look for the probability of having been born through the Genesis program and having multiple powers, what we're really looking at is the probability of being born through the Genesis program times the probability of having multiple powers given I was born through the Genesis program. Well, you're going to take the 15% times the 40% and you're going to get 0.06, or there's a 6% chance that a randomly selected superpowered infant was conceived through the Genesis program and has multiple powers. Just a 6% chance. Okay, I also want you to think of it like this, okay? And I want to use this Venn diagram to sort of generate an intuition about what's going on. This box represents all the super powered infants born, okay, in the DC universe, right? So this is super powered infants in the DC universe. And remember, the Genesis program altogether, see, it's kind of small in here. Altogether, this is like 15% of the box of all of the super powered infants. So all Genesis program is 15%. It's this small circle inside this larger frame of all these super powered infants. Now, maybe there's lots of multiple powered individuals just born naturally or in other programs and stuff. But what we know is that this part right here is 40% of the Genesis program, right? Multiple powers is 40% of the Genesis program. So what I need is 40% of the 15% that is the whole circle. So what is 40% of the 15%? Well, that's pretty obvious, right? It's 0.40, right? 40% is a decimal, of means times, and 15% is 0.15 as a decimal. And so that's what gives us our 6% that we got above. But this is why, right? Genesis program is 15% of the whole, and multiple powers is 40% of that 15%. Okay, so now let's look at a different probability. Okay, so here is our second problem, right? What is the probability that a randomly selected superpowered infant born through the Genesis program, so randomly selected but born through the Genesis program, does not possess multiple powers? Okay, now here it's not born through the Genesis program and there's no and here. We're the not possessing multiple powers is from an infant born through the program. Okay, now this not introduces the idea of a complement. So we're going to let B prime be the complement of B, or you could say B complement or not B. Hence, the probability that a randomly selected infant conceived through the Genesis program did not result in multiple powers is, from your book, you probably have the complement rule. And so not an event is equal to 1 minus the event. So the probability of an event not happening is equal to 1 minus the probability of the event happening. Okay? Now, this means that the probability of not an event given A is going to be equal to 1 minus the probability of the event given A. So now remember, it's just A is this probability that B is contingent on. And so whatever the probability of B is given A, the complement has to be this subtraction to get not having B happen. Now, from the above, we know that the probability of multiple powers given being born through the Genesis program is 40%. So this means that the probability of no multiple powers given you were born through the Genesis program means that it's the 1 minus the probability of multiple powers given through the Genesis program, which is 1 minus 0.40 is equal to 0.60. Therefore, the probability that a randomly selected superpowered infant conceived through the Genesis program does not have multiple powers is 60%. Now that conceived through the Genesis program is very, very important, right? We can't leave that out. Now, again, just like we did before, we're going to look at this picture again, but now I'm sort of zoomed in. Here's all of the Genesis program, right? Here's all of the Genesis program. And again, 40% of the Genesis program is taken up with multiple powers. 40% is taken up with multiple powers. Well, if all we're looking at this is the Genesis program, then that means that 60% has to be over here, right? Because the 60% that don't have plus the 40% that do have adds up to 100% of all births. And so we can use the Venn diagram to help improve our conceptual understanding. All right, one last problem. Would it be unusual for a randomly selected superpowered infant to have been born through the Genesis program and to not possess multiple powers? Oh, so now we have the and here, and we have the complement. Okay, so we actually know that the probability here is the Genesis program and not multiple powers. So this is part complement from our earlier problem. So given the and, we're going to have the probability of the Genesis program, but now that's going to be multiplied by the probability of not multiple powers, given you were born in the Genesis program, right? Because we have the not multiple powers. Well, we know both of those. One is 15%, the other is 60%. And when you multiply those together, you have 9%. So of all superpowered infants, about 9% are going to be born through the Genesis program and only have one superpower. Okay? Now, this was asking, would it be unusual? Well, an event that occurs with a probability of 5% or less than that is typically considered unusual. And if you've studied the normal curve or you know about levels of significance, then this 5% makes a lot of sense. But from the above, that would mean that 9% is greater than 5%, and so we would not consider this unusual. And again, in the world of DC where Batman and Superman are normal, probably having somebody born through the Genesis program not having multiple powers is probably not that unusual. So if you got something out of this video, please give it a like. I'm pretty much just doing this for the likes and to help students like you. If you have ideas for another video or thoughts, leave them in the comments. This type of engagement makes me happy.